Good evening. It's Tuesday night, a night for Kali, and in particular, a most intriguing subject, the Vedic foundations, or if you like, the earlier attested expressions, for that great goddess, so prominent today in the popular consciousness. Now, the reason why we've gone off to look into this matter, or this matter as the case may be, other than my usual motivations, that is because we recently had a bit of a run-in with one of these neo-Vedic types upon the subject, and much to my annoyance, they often seem to be far more enthused about the neo-dimension than the Vedic. Now, to quote what he had to say upon the matter, open quotes, interesting take for Hindus to ponder. Certainly not only Kali herself, but anything like Kali, that is to say, dreadful-looking Ansi, goddess of wrath, doesn't exist in Vedic religion. Of course, the goddesses take part in battle, but this cannot be pressed into Kali worship. End quote. Now, if you haven't encountered these sorts out there in the wild before, their general gimmick is to jump up and down about prominent elements of our modern Hindu religion and shrilly declare that these have nothing whatsoever to do with the Vedic religion of 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 years before. And while I am certainly not one to disagree with the notion of defending and upholding the Vedas, I do think it is probably rather useful if the persons appointing themselves to indulge in this kind of thing actually have some idea of what's in the Vedas before seeking to declare elements to our modern religion to be fundamentally out of keeping with same. Call me old-fashioned like that. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at Kali in the Vedas. Now, the first place for us to start is Shankayana Gauri Sutra 2.14.14. And I do apologize my pronunciation of Sanskrit. It's going to be all over the show all evening, as possibly with the Old Norse and Ancient Greek. We'll get into that, but more on that in the future. Now, in this particular text, it's a relatively late one, but nonetheless, it is still part of the Vedas. There, in amidst the household offerings, we do quite literally hear of a Bhadra Kali being quite directly attested, Shri at one end of the bed, Bhadra Kali at the other. Yet a simple attestation like that is probably rather unsatisfying to his sort, so we shall press on further, because, as it happens, there are actually an array of further figures who are recognizably resonant with Kali. Consider these to be earlier expressions, adjacent understandings perhaps. Just because they may not be held by the specific name of Kali does not vitiate their essential coterminity of essence with her. Now at this point, I ought to make something clear. We are not going for the proverbial low bar here of just proving that there are, in some nebulous sense, goddess of wrath type figures, as that guy had put it, nor merely that they may be dreadful looking. No, we're in search of something more refined, and those features, wrath and a fearsome appearance, are definitely important. But it's the transformation to the baleful form, along with the purpose to the aspects being assumed, that's absolutely key here. This, after all, is basically, if we wanted to think about Kali in the popular mythology, how one would tend to regard her. Not simply as an independent, standalone goddess form, although you can do that, it gets into some complex theology, but rather as a more aggressive form, as an angry form, a wrathful form, a dreadful-looking form, that assumes such dread, bale visage in response to a particular, often hugely demonic, hugely otherwise intractable threat. So, as was said, that moment of transition to a more fearsome visage is absolutely key to our Kali typology. So, to begin, one of my favourite goddess forms, Vach, the goddess of speech, Vach as in vox, or voice. These are cognate terms. The context is Shatapatha Brahmana 3.5.2.8. The verse in question is one which deals with part of the, well, how would we put this, with the processes via which the fire is brought forward to the main high altar, in preparation for a rather potent rite, this being Upasad's observance, which we've occasionally spoken of previously. I like to translate the Upasad as siege, although of course other renderings are also possible. Now, as part of these operations, it is vitally imperative to cleanse and expurgate the ritual space, to drive forth the demons which might be lurking therein, and who might otherwise seek to disrupt the ritual. There are many and various approaches to this. Each tends to be mythically resonant, we might say, as its essential structure. That is to say, some mythic template is reenacted down here in the microcosm, technically the mesocosm. Brief side point on that. So, in terms of how a lot of Hindu and of course Indo-European ritual works, we might think of it as a, not quite a triplanar cosmology, but there's the mythic realm, the mythic sphere up here, wherein God's mighty deeds of, as we say, myth have already occurred. And there's the microcosm down here. Macrocosm? Microcosm. The microcosm being where we inhabit and also our immediate surrounds. The ritual space, so to speak, is a mesocosm, that is to say, the bit in between, wherein actions are undertaken to resonate down from the mythic realm, things out into our more immediate realm down here in the microcosm. You might say that these actions also resonate far more broadly than those which just take place within the ritual enclosure, which also stands in a microcosmic sense for the world, the universe entire, or more specialized parts of that. Long story for another time, I digress. So, in any case, you can see why the efforts to expurgate the ritual space so that a complex rite can take place would logically draw from these macrocosmic, these mythic understandings for how the gods themselves were able to drive out demons from a particular expanse of the universe to make safe for their operations, for their domain, well, pretty much what we're going to do down here, or rather what the ritual operationists would do, we should say. Anyway, to get back to where we were in our text. Now, I am particularly fond of the exorcism rites which are conducted for this particular ritual, as they feature our good friends the Salavrikas, that is to say the temple wolves. These are encountered on the right of the altar. That's my right, and I'm unsure of how that's going to translate for people watching at home. In the south, because of course a Vedic altar in this context faces the east, the direction of the rising sun. So, the left of the altar, that's north. The right of the altar, by contrast, that is south. This is, of course, the direction of death, Yama's realm, and, of course, Dakshina, right, Dexter, you get the idea. What are these Salavrikas doing down there? Well, that's partially where the mouth of the realm of the ancestors may be found. There is a wolf and ancestor cotemoeti possibly in evidence. But they are poised to tear into the thrice-accursed Yatins, the sorcerers and demon traffickers who might have sought to steal the wife of the priest in some later concept tree, but more upon that some other time. To bring things back to Vach, we encounter her here in Shatapatha Brahmana 3528 as having assumed the figurative form of a lioness, and as with those aforesaid Salavrikas, she is in connection with the southern direction to the ritual space, the direction of death, and proverbial jaws of the underworld, and cf. Taittiriya Samhita 627, wherein those jaws get rather literal. We'll be encountering that in a moment. Now, she in this wrathful state, Ashanti I think is the Sanskrit in question, I do apologize once again for the pronunciation, and leonine visage, we presume with the big teeth and the roar, which are strong Kali identifying features in later texts, she is called upon by the ritualist to smite his foeman, and to send his adversary screaming into the next world. Shokan, I'm going to have some difficulty pronouncing that. Shokan Neva Mum would probably be one way of looking at it. We'll discuss the breakdown of that some other time, I believe. And we do not intend to discuss the rather delicious word that Egerling has actually translated as exorcism a bit further in, because there's some elements in there which we're not allowed to speak about in public. Long story for another time. But let us take a look at his rendition for the verse in more general terms. That's the Egerling translation. 8. The sprinkling water, which is left, he pours outside the altar, close to where is the southern of the two front corners of the high altar with, "This burning water I dismiss from the sacrifice, because she," Vach, informed the altar, "on that occasion became a lioness and roamed about unappeased. He thus dismisses from the sacrifice that sorrow of hers, if he do not wish to exercise. But should he wish to exercise, let him indicate it by saying, 'This burning water I dismiss from the sacrifice against so-and-so.' He then smites him with that sorrow, and sorrowing he goes to yonder world." End translation. Now, for comparative interest, here's the broadly same ritualistic understanding as presented in the Taittiriya Samhita. Actually, brief pause on that. Right, so, for those who aren't familiar with how various Vedic texts work, the Yajurveda is the one that has a lot of the really rather important ritual conceptry, you might say. They've all got ritual conceptry, obviously, but for some of the more ornate rites, I'm paraphrasing wildly. Now, there are several recensions or versions of this particular text. They're broadly the same, but they have some key differences in particular ways. So, what we've just quoted from in the above is from the Shatapatha Brahmana. That is not actually part of the Samhita, the actual main text of the Yajurveda. That's a commentary, you might say, or ritual manual, which is attached to the Shukla Yajurveda, one particular version of that, the bright or white Yajurveda, the clear one, we might say, to basically explain the ritual stuff, the steps which are supposed to go alongside the actual liturgies which are contained within the Samhita, which it attaches to. Now, the other major Yajurvedic recension which you'll often encounter is the TS, the Taittiriya Samhita, which of course is what we're going about to quote from, which is the more sort of, well, it's a dark one, so to speak. It's more of a bird's nest. It's the figurative meaning for its title, because what we encounter therein are the ritual instructions actually being interspersed in with the liturgy itself. So it's a bit more complex. It's actually probably shorter than the sort of the commentary plus approach of the other sort of major recension, but just to explain why there are two different versions of this particular ritual element which don't quite agree with each other. In any case, I think it's the Keith translation. Is the Keith translation? We'll find out. The verse in question is 6 to 7, 4 to 5. In fact, I like this so much that I'm going to quote almost the whole thing, rather than just what we're interested in here, which is just the last bit. "May the cry of Indra guard thee in front with the vasus," he says. "Verily," he sprinkles it from the quarters. "Since the high altar has gone to the gods, here we must conquer," thought the Asuras, and with bolts ready, they advanced on the gods. Them, the cry of Indra with the vasus repelled in front, the swift of mind with the Pitaras on the right, the wise one with the Rudras behind, and Vishvakarman with the Adityas on the left. In that he sprinkles the high altar. Verily, thus does the sacrificer repel his foes from the quarters. Indra gave the yatis to the Salavrikas. Then they ate on the right of the high altar. Whatever is left of the sprinkling waters, he should pour on the right of the high altar. Whatever is cruel is there that he appeases thereby. He should think of whomever he hates. Verily he brings affliction upon him." In quotes. Very evocative stuff. Now, in terms of the linking part, we might say, for our Kali understanding, note the cruel, which is used there on the right of that high altar. Kruram, we would say in Sanskrit. Now, in terms of the other figures that are encountered there, the Pitaras, the forefathers, the ancestors. Father is in fact cognate with Pitara. That's the realm of the ancestors concept we talked about. The swift of mind, Manujava. Sayana took this in the Shatapatha Brahmana version to be Yama, the god of death. One of the many gods of death we have as it happens. Right, of course, as we said, being the south, the direction of death, which is where you will find Yama's realm even today. The fact that I'm currently recording in New Zealand, in the southern hemisphere, may perhaps be relevant here. But why is Kruram relevant? Well, it's not an exclusive Kali term, but it is frequently occurrent for her. Cf. the Krura or Krurai in Agni Purana 146, or Devi Bhagavata Purana 824, or the Kalika Sahasranama Stotram Ameya Vikrama Krura, which of course, we won't translate for the moment, but suffice to say that it's quite an impressive term for great potency and great cruelty being meted out against the demonic or the demon trafficking foe. So this space over here where the cruelness is, that is the space where this lioness form of Vach is to be found, this wrathful form, this form that is rather annoyed about things, as we said. So it's not just Vach in the form of a lioness. As we encountered in the Shatapatha Brahmana version of things, it's a very annoyed lioness. And you can see how that fits quite nicely with the general typology for Kali, especially when we think about what that lioness is rather there to do, which is to drive forth these demons, we would implicitly say, as with the Salavrikas, to devour them. Now also, on that particular point, those temple wolves, the Salavrikas, which are encountered over there in the south, there's a rather frequent association for Kali-style deifics or mythic expressions with these wolves, particularly in the Atharva Veda. We'll be meeting some of those in due course. So we might suggest, therefore, that it's resonant with our general typology, we should say. And if you're playing the Old Norse version of this game at home, we would point out the situation of Skadi, whom we've long argued to be a Nordic expression of the same deific complex, being so prominently associated with the howls of those wolves, which is precisely the dimension which is part of that coterminity in the Atharva Veda. As we say, I digress. Now, to move back to our ritual conceptry, Shatapatha Brahmana 35133 and Tattariya Samhita 628, both of these have Vach in agitated lioness form, and interestingly, Ashanta could be read to be unsanctified, so to speak, similar to how Nirrti works, which is relevant for the dread sanctioning of any person who would transgress religious propriety, and we shall be meeting Nrrti in due course. And of course we encounter Vach there more pointedly, engaged in the defeating of foes, or asuras. That's asuras, i.e. demons, dealt to on behalf of the gods in the latter text, and foes, more generically speaking I suppose you might say, in the former. Although with Shatapatha Brahmana 35125, this also has the lioness form of Vach pointedly destroying the man who breaches a particular rule of religious propriety. So you can see how there's a bit of a thematic thing going on here, whereby the goddess, these wrathful forms, are invoked for the specific purpose of upholding cosmic law and the immanency thereof. Those who've read a fair amount of my work will know exactly where my mind is going in this particular dimension. But I digress once more. But to run with that theme, we have the goddess of Atharva Veda, that's in the, not the Pavaladis, sort of recension, 12.5, which we again understand to be Vach, which is a long story as to why, but basically sort of the Brahmana/Vach relationship set out in AV-S XII into many earlier, and again taking on the wrathful, terrific, active expression to smite the evildoer. Now, I must resist temptation here because I really do rather like this particular hymnal. I've referenced it quite frequently in a number of my written works. Okay, we'll just do a brief bit on it. Right, so this hymnal is generally entitled something along the line of, the Brahman's cow or something, and it's often been understood as being the cow belonging to the Brahmana who's acting as, the sacrifice of the priest, and therefore somebody's trying to steal his cow. Now that's not incorrect, generally speaking. It's just that there's also another dimension to it as well, whereby Brahmana in this sense can also be understood in the older version, whereby it means a ritual element. So that's why I referenced AV-S 1148 just beforehand, because what you have there is a coextension in the universe as ritual space. That's our mesocosmic bits and pieces as aforementioned, resonating with the macrocosm, wherein what happens is Vach, it's a complex thing around the imprinting of the sacred speech and its essence inside these ritual elements. So, the Brahmana's cow, you can see how this logically links back into this. Especially when somebody might try and disrupt the rite, when somebody might try to hijack the rite, when somebody might try to make off with the goddess and the goddess saliency, which is at the core of any Vedic ritual. Now, what happens then is, well, let's just put it this way. Brahmins can be very scary especially in the context of these Vedic rites, whereby you have these almost sort of superpowered figures who have these war mantras which are incredibly potent, can strike down people, cause meteors to fall from the sky and carry out audible bombardments, all sorts of things. Do not mess with a Vedic Brahmin. But the goddess at the center of these things is not powerless herself. She's not, you might say, a damsel in distress in the conventional sense of the term, waiting to be liberated. No, she's quite capable of taking on this wrathful destroyer form herself and really, really messing up stuff for the person who dared to try and steal her away, if properly sort of roused to wrath. So, as I say, it's a lengthy and quite excitingly violent invocation, and I must restrain myself from going into too much depth and detail about it herein. But suffice to say, she has become Nrrti, death, in lines 21 and 55. And is called upon not merely to kill the target of her wrath, but to excoriate and scorch Chindi and Cha. Sorry, the KSA, I can't pronounce that quite right. This is doubled up for emphasis at line 51 to really underscore just how, chopping into little pieces, we might say, and then sort of setting them on fire to, that gets across the appropriate sense, but to really, really mete out the appropriate level of vitriolic condemnation and sanction against the transgressor. It's quite a cautionary thing, you might say. It is no wonder that Gauri and Krurani, in lines 13 and 14 respectively, are utilized to describe her, in the context of saying all the terrific and cruel is within her, when she is roused to righteous fury via deeds against the faith. And as a brief point of interest, she is described as Vaishvadevi and Angarasi in lines 53 and 52 respectively, which we mention as it's always reminded us of the emanation of Durga in the Devi Mahatmyam and Skanda Purana, that being 120, from the All Gods. Now, for those of you who aren't sort of quite familiar with the relevant Hindu mythology here, what basically happens as applies Durga, who is a more conventional warrior goddess, you might say, as opposed to death incarnate and hyper-lethal in that sense. I mean, no bones about it. Durga is definitely hyper-lethal, but it's relatively more restrained than the absolute just annihilation, which Kali, of course, connotes. But what happens in those contexts, when Durga is being invoked, it is done by the All Gods. What you have happen is various of the gods come together, and all of them they speak, they sing this goddess into being, or rather to congeal her. She's never not in being, but to sort of bring forth their energies, which she has actually invested into them, and bring it out to congeal into this warrior avenger force of fury that is going to strike down the particular demon that none of the rest of them are able to fight against. Brief tangent there. But in terms of the Angarasi element, daughter of Angiras. Now, Angiras would be either the specific Angiras, that is the rishi, or alternatively, and probably slightly more likely here, a term of general saliency for a class of priests. The actual root of the word Angiras is shared with what's the term? Angaraka. The word for Mars, which means the color of burning charcoal, which is quite evocative for Mars. And of course you can see how this orange burning colour goes quite nicely with a Vedic rite. In any case, we would take this in the figurative sense, this daughter of Angiras, of having been invoked into this world by the priest. Our typology for this is informed by Katyayani, another name for Durga, relative to Katyayana, that being the priest who focalizes, wonderful word there, who focuses or finalizes the divine energy, the Tejas, to manifest as her. Now, we're not going to try and read the relevant Vamana Purana section. Suffice to say, if you want to look it up yourselves, it is 19:7. And in the Dunlap translation, and, O sage, Narada, that splendor, resembling a mountain peak, went to oneness, became unified, in the great hermitage of the incomparable Katyayana. And the splendor was favored or enhanced by that great seer. So that Tejas element, the fire goes with the altar fire, which of course is where Vach is rather pertinent to in that earlier Shatapatha Brahmana concept tree, and of course this cow we find in the context of the Brahmana's cow, so to speak, which once again, not really a literal cow as much as the goddess empowering the whole, right? You might think in classical terms of Hestia. That's actually a very good example, because elsewhere in terms of these Wrathful Lioness forms, we actually encounter Vach being propitiated via getting the first share of the offering in a manner directly commensurate with how we find Hestia being held in the Homeric corpus. I digress. But as you can see, this notion of being focused by the great sage, well, that's how she becomes, figuratively speaking, the daughter of the sage in question. And as for what Katyayana is, well, I have occasionally phrased him as being an etymologist. That's something to be very careful around as a properly empowered and pious etymologist. He's more usually encountered as a grammarian, but I think we can allow for that slight variation in terms of his particular work here. I digress. Now, as a further point of brief interest, in AV-S 12.5.48, we encounter familiar figures, to me anyway, the Kashini, the wild-haired, dancing at the cremation. We assume it was post-mortem, of the wrongdoer, and making the howl of sin, Papamalabam, at him. So you can see some of the elements of our typology really sort of coming to fruition there. We've got a figure, female, with the wild hair, being encountered at the cremation grounds, engaged in dance, roaring or howling. Vikeshi, in terms of that wild-haired element, is also an epithet of the consort of Rudra. In terms of Angaraka, etc., if I remember correctly, a mother figure thereof, but I may have erred slightly there. More on that some other time. But in terms of those elements at a cremation ground, engaged in dance, roaring and howling, punishing sin, wild-haired, some might say these Kashini figures sound rather familiar. And not just because, yes, Kali, but also because in the famed Sarva and Bhava Rudra hymnal, that is AV-11.2, we meet the Vikeshi and Kashini as part of Rudra's ganas as well, alongside those hounds, which we've mentioned before as well. We have long observed that Kali presents an archetypal apex for these of the female ganas of Rudra, who themselves also express the matrika clades of later scripture. Now, in terms of a manifestation of this, to sort of encounter, you might say, this archetypal apex in amidst those female ganas, we turn to Griffith's translation of the Kumara Sambhava of Kalidasa, that is to say, the birth of the war god, Skanda, featuring Kali in amidst day. The matrons, the matrikas, followed him, a saintly throng, their earrings waving as they dashed along. Sweet faces, with such glories round them shed, as made the air one lovely lotus bed. On flew those bright ones, Kali came behind, the skulls that decked her rattling in the wind, like the dark rack that scuds across the sky, with herald lightning and the crane's shrill cry. Hark! From the glorious bands that lead the way, harp, drum, and pipe, and shrilling trumpets bray, burst through the sky upon the startled ear, and tell the gods the hour of worship's near. Now, that's a very interesting verse for a number of reasons. One of which being, of course, the mention around the crane's shrill cry. Now, that word crane itself, it's from the same, sort of ger, I think, from memory, Proto-Indo-European particle that basically it's a whole bunch of terms for harsh noises, kind of like thunder. That harsh noise, that roaring sense, of course, being something which is quite iconic for Kali, as previously mentioned, and informs the crows and my name as well, as it happens. But long story for another time in that regard. But in terms of why this is particularly interesting to us, this verse which we've just gone through, at that point in the poem, what's going on is Shiva is going to meet his bride, Parvati, who, for those unaware, what's happened is, following the horse sacrifice of Daksha, Sati, the earlier incarnation of Shiva's wife, has killed herself in rather tragic circumstances, which led to a roaring Rudra rampage of revenge against the perpetrators of the circumstances in question. So she'd been dead, figuratively speaking, and had to reincarnate as Parvati, Girja, the daughter of the mountain. Shiva had to re-find her and then remarry in this new incarnation. Part of the reason for that is so that they could conceive Skanda, the war god, so as to be able to fight a particular demon, Tarakasura, because this demon, as of course divine legalism often has it, had sought a boon from Brahma that he would be invulnerable. And of course, why I say divine legalism is because nobody's ever completely invulnerable. They always have to have some weakness, which they often try and choose the most unlikely one they can think of. In the case of Tarakasura, he chose to have his bane be the next born son of Shiva, because Shiva, due to his incredible love of Sati, was highly unlikely to remarry at any point in the near future. Therefore, he thought he'd be safe if a son that could not be conceived would be the only one who could kill him. Hence the necessity of this incarnation, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So, we've got a bit of a paradox here, because the situation of Shiva going to meet his bride, and yet at the same time Kali already being around, and part of this, this Matragana sort of clade which is associated with him. How can she be in two places at once, we might say? Well, the simple answer is a goddess can do all sorts of things. The slightly more involved answer as to why this this figure of Kali is moving in the company of these other fearsome female figures, the Mantrakas, is because Shiva's Shakti never truly is completely separated from him. Anyway, we should probably move forward. Now, other than Nrrti, night, probably the most prominent of the like Kali Vedic deific expressions we have would have to be Nirrti. So, here's the Shukla Yajurveda in the VS version 1262-65 and Taittiriya Samhita 4-5 GTM. Once again, broadly correlate sort of sets of verses with some subtle differences between them. Now, in line 64, and I part of the second thing, because the Taittiriya Samhita is broken up in a slightly different way in the translation. Nirrti is also known as earth, Bhumir. This is an understanding which is attested elsewhere. The reason why this is relevant for our typology is because, as we've seen with those other examples, Vach turning into a wrathful lioness, or the situation by the Brahman's cow becomes, well, death incarnate, quite literally, per the Atharavanic verses aforementioned. What we have here is Earth, the goddess, taking on a different form, and the precise parameters of that we shall encounter in a moment. So, leading in with clear Yajurveda, line 62. Seek him who pours not, offers not oblation. Follow the going of the thief and robber. This is thy way. Leave us and seek some other. To thee, O goddess Nrrti, be homage. To thee, sharp-pointed Nrrti, full homage. Loose and detach this iron bond that binds him. Unanimous with Yama and with Yami, to the sublimest vault of heaven uplift him. Thou, awful one, thou in whose mouth I offer for the unloosing of these binding fetters, whom people hail as Earth, with their glad voices as Nrrti. In every place I know thee. The binding noose which Nrrti the goddess has fastened on thy neck, that none may loose it, I loose for thee, as from the midst of Ayuth, sped forward now. Eat thou the food we offer, to Fortune, her who hath done this, be homage. Brief point on that. Fortune, you may recall the earlier Griha Sutra bits and pieces with which we began. Shri at one end, Bhadrakali at the other. Bhadrakali you might translate possibly as the auspicious or fortunate Kali. You see how things begin to fit together. Now, in terms of the TS, that's the Black Yajurveda version question. G. Homage to thee, O Nrrti, of every form. Loosen ye this bond made of iron. Do thou in accord with Yama and Yami. Mount this highest vault. The bond that Nrrti, the goddess, bound on thy neck, not to be loosened, this I loosen for thee, as from the middle of life. Then living, let loose, do thou eat the food. Thee in whose cruel mouth here I make offering, for the loosening of these bonds. As earth, men know thee, as Nrrti, I know thee on every side. Seek the man who poureth not offering nor sacrifices, the road of the thief and robber thou followest. Seek another than us, that is thy road. Homage be to thee, O Nrrti, O goddess, praising Nrrti, the goddess. Like a father, his son, I weary her with my words. She who knoweth all that is born, discerneth, the lady, every head. Abode and collector of riches, every form she discerneth with might. Like the god Savitar, of true laws, like Indra, she standeth at the meeting of the ways. That's the Keith translation. The earlier clear Yajurveda translation was the Griffith. Now, in terms of some points of interest from all of this, we would first up note that the elements like Gora, which is not Gora as in me, but G-H-R-I, I'm not quite adroit with the slight difference in pronunciation between white person and terrifying. I'm sure there's no subtext to that whatsoever. But at VS 1164, that's where we encounter this term for terrific. And Krura, that cruel term we've aforementioned, in TS 425I, you can see these are once again in play and relate directly to some of those earlier encounters we've had in those other texts, as is a prominent mouth and the sanctioning of transgressors. You see how this all begins to fit together. The potential for a crossroads association in the TS text, that's the second one we just read, is also relevant for other reasons. Those being in particular connection to Ambika and Rudra, and of course as well as various elements in the Greek understanding that we have written quite extensively about and may address at some other juncture. And yes, you can also link that particular detail and the earth element underlying this Nrrti's encountered terrific expression here with the Mula Nakshatra and its fertility and plant linkages, as attested in Taittiriya Brahmana 3123 and 3153 and earlier, which is Nrrti's. This is in the Jyotisha, the astrological sphere. I'm writing a long article on that for some other time. However, our key point here is that, once again, we find an instance of differing forms, wherein Earth becomes Nrrti, it should seem. Rather like Parvati becoming Kali, no? But where there's actual transformation, well, we do actually find this somewhat attested in AV-S XII, as it happens. There we encounter the Arati, which is to say the aggressive, the annoyed, or the swiftly moving about, the agitated, furious, you might say, form of the goddess, who upon being propitiated should seem to be Nrrti, which is what we find in lines 9 to 10. Except whereas Nrrti is more usually dark or black, cf. TS 5242 in visage, and regarded as baleful, here she's regarded as Subhaga, which is to say auspicious, and of decidedly lighter complexion and golden hair, the actual terms being Hiranyavarna and Hiranyakesi. Gauri, we might perhaps say. Now, what I'm referencing there is because the situation of Kali transiting to Gauri, or Mahakali to Mahagauri, the great fair one, is one that is quite prominent in the later Puranic mythology. In fact, it's one of those leitmotif elements which shows up not only in the context of the Puranic expression, whereby sort of Kali goes and sort of washes off the patina of darkness, following this form no longer really being sort of quite necessary, to reassume the bright, sort of light, sort of golden, radiant form. This also shows up on a pretty much one-to-one basis in various Western Indo-European understandings as well. For example, in the Greek understanding, where our great friend, Demeter Erinys, or Demeter Melaina, which is to say Demeter the Furious, Demeter the Black, she likewise undertakes one of these sort of sacred bath things to wash off the dark patina, and therefore discard, as it's no longer necessary for her, this black, furious, avenging form, and reassume this bright, light, golden, radiant, beautiful form. So the fact that we encounter this in the Hellenic sphere, as well as in the Vedic sphere, and there's also some other examples we're not getting into here, would therefore seem to suggest that what we have is an archaic Indo-European typology. Quite the opposite of suggesting, as that rather woeful gentleman we're sort of responding to here, as quite the opposite of his inference that it was some Puranic, post-Vedic construction. It's evidently quite an archaic understanding indeed. I digress. Now, the actual Hindu situation, which we've just glossed over there. I've gotten rather ahead of myself in my enthusiasm. Wherein this black exterior form gets sloughed off, it actually becomes a separate form, which is independently ambulatory. Or, if you prefer, ambika, blatri, it's rather late there for my rather woeful pun there, and engages in a spate of demon slaying after this event. This form is known as Kajiki. And speaking of ambika, and Vedic underpinnings to later Puranic expressions, we are also reminded of the situation in Demeter Brahmana 1.6.10.4, wherein Ambika, as Rudra's female counterpart, presides over autumn, Sharada, and kills in such a context. Hence the necessity to her propitiation. I told you the crossroads point would be coming back, guess where? To avoid such, we presume that she departs along with Rudra from that place and right with blessing thusly bestowed in life-granting result. Why do I mention this? Because this is rather familiar to us here in the modern day, although up till now perhaps them teeth of the facing of death might not have been. But you can go back and rewind for context there. Now, in terms of what I'm mentioning, it is Nrrti for Chandika, carrying forward that Vedic Ambika rite. So, to quote from the Devi Bhagavata Purana in the Vijayananda translation, line 3-5, Vyasa said, O king, hear about the vow of auspicious Navaratra. This has to be performed with loving devotion in the vernal season, but its special season is autumn. The two seasons, autumn and spring, are famous as the teeth of Yama, the god of death. And these are the two seasons, very hard for persons to cross over. Therefore, every good-faring man should everywhere perform this vow very carefully. Lines 6-8. O king, the people are very much afflicted with various terrible diseases in these two seasons, autumn and spring, and many lose their lives during these portions of the year. Therefore the wise should unquestionably worship with great devotion the Chandika Devi in these auspicious months of Chaitra and Ashvin. Devi Bhagavata Purana 3.26, Vijayananda translation. As it happens, we've just gone through one of those Navratris, autumn down here, but of course spring for those of you in the Northern Hemisphere. In any case, to bring things back to our starting point, we sought to respond to the claim that there was allegedly an absence of anything like Kali in the Vedic religion. That's the exact quote, anything like Kali in the Vedic religion. I think we've just shown that even though perhaps Guhya, that is to say hidden, secretive, she has very much been present in the Vedas, insofar as the clear typology of the goddess taking on a dark or baleful, dread visage of furious, cruel and terrific qualities, along with, often, the pertinent more, so as to protect the religion, to smite foes and to uphold propriety in the divine order, can be seen both then and now. Jai Matati. So to speak towards their cruram quality, on grievous as well as grave display, when she is roused to wrath, and with it rack and ruin, we can hardly do better than to quote the last few lines in Griffith translation of the Yajurveda Vedas hymnal 12.5. That's the BS rather than P recension. With 100-knotted thunderbolt, sharpened and edged with razor blades, strike off the shoulders and the head, snatch thou the hair from off his head, and from his body strip the skin, tear out his sinews, cause his flesh to fall in pieces from his frame, crush thou his bones together, strike and beat the marrow out of him, dislocate all his limbs and joints. From earth let the carnivorous Agni drive him, let Vayu burn him in the mid-air's broad region. From heaven let Surya drive him and consume him. Jai Ma Kali, Jai Matati. Good evening.